There are men the whole town thinks they know, until a stranger appears and turns it all upside down. Gideon Hale was one such man. 12 years he refused every wealthy lady who knocked on his farm door. 12 years he lived alone with his livestock, the cracks in his hands, and a secret he dared not look directly at. Then she came, not with gold or silver, not with beautiful promises, only with a tattered old letter entrusted to him by the dead. If you are reading this story, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because what that letter reveals will change everything. The widow Carveth arrived on a Tuesday, same as the last three before her. Gideon Hale watched her carriage roll through the front gate from the upper pasture, one boot propped on the fence rail, a strip of dried jerky working between his back teeth. He didn't move. He recognized the carriage, black lacquered panels, a matched pair of chestnuts, the kind of rig that cost more than most ranchers earned in 3 years. He'd seen it parked outside the Dunmore Hotel twice already this season. "She's here again," called Remy Tuck from down the fence line. Remy was Gideon's oldest hand, 53 years old, weathered down to the bone, missing the tip of his left ring finger from a roping accident in 1871 that he told differently every time. "You want me to head her off?" "No." Gideon took another bite of jerky. "Let her come up. You're going to send her away anyway. I know that. She doesn't yet." Remy spat in the dirt and went back to stretching wire. Margaret Carveth was 51, handsome in the way that money preserved things. Her hair still dark, her clothes still fine, her posture still impeccable after 2 decades of marriage to a man who'd built the third largest cattle operation in Harlan County before his heart gave out over a plate of biscuits and gravy. She had every reason to expect a favorable reception. She had land, capital, social standing, and according to the Dunmore Hotel's front desk clerk, a very pleasant disposition. She also had, Gideon suspected, a fairly clear-eyed understanding of what a merger between the Carveth Holdings and the Hale Ranch would mean for both parties involved. He met her at the porch steps. Didn't invite her inside. "Mrs. Carveth," he said. "Mr. Hale." She smiled. It was a practiced smile, warm without being excessive. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not intruding. What can I do for you?" She looked at him for a moment, recalibrating. Most men softened at the sight of her. She'd learned to read the small tells, the straightening of the spine, the unconscious tidying of the hat. Gideon Hale showed none of it. He stood on his own porch steps like a man who'd already decided the outcome of a conversation he hadn't started yet. "I thought perhaps we might discuss a matter of mutual interest," she said. "My late husband's eastern pasture borders your northern boundary. I've been advised that there may be benefit in Mrs. Carveth." He said it without cruelty, but without apology either. "I appreciate you making the ride out here, truly. But I'm not in the market for a partnership of any kind, business or otherwise." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded, once, with the composure of a woman who had survived worse disappointments than a stubborn rancher on a Tuesday afternoon. "You're a difficult man, Mr. Hale." "So I've been told." "The town says you're still grieving your father." Something moved across Gideon's face, fast, like a shadow from a passing cloud, gone before it settled into anything recognizable. "The town says a lot of things," he said. She left without another word. He watched the carriage until the dust folded back over the road, then went inside and poured himself 3 fingers of rye and stood at the kitchen window drinking it slowly, not tasting any of it. His father, Clement Hale, had been gone for 11 years. Not dead. Not officially. He'd ridden out in the fall of 1868 on what he called a survey trip, part of a land documentation effort he'd been involved with for the better part of a year. He'd taken 2 horses, a pack mule, and a saddlebag full of papers that Gideon had never been allowed to examine. He'd kissed Gideon's mother on the forehead, told Gideon, 17 years old at the time, gangly and furious about something he couldn't articulate, that he'd be back before the first snow. He was not back before the first snow. He was not back ever. The search parties went out twice, found one of the horses 20 miles southeast, shot through the leg and left to die near a dry creek bed, found the pack mule's saddle, found nothing else. No body, no papers, No explanation from anyone that held up to a second question. The official conclusion, rendered by the county sheriff at the time, a man named Dutton, who'd since moved to Albuquerque, was that Clement Hale had likely been killed by road agents somewhere in the territory beyond Ridgecroft Pass. Robbery gone bad. These things happened. The frontier was not a gentle place. Gideon's mother had accepted this with a quietness that frightened him more than any amount of weeping would have. She died 4 years later of pneumonia that no one seemed to think was directly related to anything but the cold. Gideon knew better. He'd watched her spend those 4 years waiting by a window she eventually stopped going to. He'd run the ranch since then, alone. He was good at it in the way that some people were good at things they'd never asked to be responsible for. Methodically, without enthusiasm, with a competence that impressed people and a distance that unsettled them. The Hale Ranch was one of the most productive spreads in the county. It was also, by most accounts, the loneliest. The offers came every few years. Women with money, women with land, women with connections, women who saw a 38-year-old man with a solid property and a functional silence and thought they could work with that. He turned them all away, not because he was cruel, not because he was still grieving, or not only because of that, but because he didn't know how to explain to anyone what it felt like to build something on top of a question that had never been answered. How could he ask another person to stand on that ground? The stranger arrived on a Thursday, late in the afternoon, when the light over the ridge had gone gold and flat. Gideon was in the barn when Remy came to find him, hat already in hand. Remy only held his hat when he was genuinely uncertain about something. "Woman at the gate," Remy said. "On foot. Came up the road from the direction of Cooperville, carrying a satchel." "What kind of woman?" Remy considered this. "Young, not fancy, tired." Gideon straightened up from the stall he'd been mucking. He looked at Remy's face and didn't find anything particularly alarming in it. Remy had good instincts. If he'd felt threatened, his posture would have shown it. "Send her up," Gideon said. She came through the barn door a few minutes later, and Gideon's first clear thought was that she looked like someone who had walked a very long way and was not about to mention it. She was maybe 25, slight, with dark hair pulled back practical, and a face that was plain in the best sense of the word. No pretension to it, no decoration, just a person who was exactly what she appeared to be. She was carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder, the kind of bag that had seen considerable use, the strap repaired at least twice with mismatched thread. She stopped a few feet inside the barn door and looked at him straight. "Are you Gideon Hale?" "I am." "My name is Eliza Rowan. I've come from Cooperville. Before that, Yardley. And before that, Fort Callum." She said it like she was reading from a document, clear and sequential. "I was with your father when he died." The silence in the barn went very deep, very fast. Gideon stood still. He was aware of the pitchfork still in his hand, the smell of hay and horse around him, the way the late light was coming through the gaps in the barn boards in thin parallel lines. He was aware of all of these things because his mind was doing what it did when something hit it too hard, cataloging the unimportant so it didn't have to touch the important all at once. "My father," he said carefully, "has been missing for 11 years. "I know." She met his eyes without flinching. He wasn't missing the whole time. He was hiding. He didn't invite her inside the house right away. He set the pitchfork down and leaned against the stall door and looked at her for a long moment, working through the geometry of it. She didn't fidget under the scrutiny. She stood with her satchel strap over her shoulder and her boots showing 3 days of road dirt and waited. "How did he die?" Gideon finally asked. "Fever. In a settlement outside Fort Callum about 7 months ago. He'd been living there under a different name for several years." She paused. "He didn't want to, living that way. He wrote you letters he never sent." "Why are you here instead of a letter?" "Because what I'm carrying can't be sent by post, and because he made me promise to deliver it in person." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, more like the acknowledgement of weight. He was a good man who made one very large mistake and spent 11 years trying to fix it before he ran out of time. Gideon looked at the satchel. "What's in there?" "A letter he wrote you, and some other things, documents mostly. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. Mr. Hale, I don't want anything from you. I'm not here to make a claim or ask for help. I walked from Cooperville because the stage didn't run until Friday, and your father asked me to come as soon as possible. I've done what I came to do. If you want to tell me to go back to town and wait for the Friday stage, I'll do that. You walked from Cooperville? 17 miles. Yes. He looked at her again. There was no performance in her, no calculation working behind her eyes. She was genuinely prepared to be sent away. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she'd already measured the distance back to the road. Come inside, he said. I'll get you something to eat. He made coffee and fried cornbread because it was what he had quick, and he set it in front of her at the kitchen table without ceremony. She ate like someone who was hungry, which meant without apology and without comment. He sat across from her and drank his coffee and waited. When she'd finished, she set the satchel on the table and opened it. The letter was on top, folded 3 times, sealed with wax that had been broken and repressed. She noticed him notice this and said, He asked me to read it first so I'd understand what I was carrying. He said you'd want to know that. He picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it. The handwriting on the outside, his name, nothing else, was his father's. He'd have known it anywhere. Clement Hale had learned to write from a schoolteacher in Virginia and had never lost the slight formal lean of it. He unfolded it. The letter was 4 pages, front and back, written in a hand that grew progressively unsteady toward the end. The fever, Gideon understood, reading backward from the final lines to understand the progression. He read it through once, quickly, and then set it down on the table and looked at the far wall for a while. You all right? Eliza asked. She didn't say it with particular gentleness. She said it the way you'd ask someone who'd just taken a hard fall whether they could walk. Give me a minute, he said. She did. The letter began with an apology that went on for most of the first page. Not the elaborate self-excusing kind, but the blunt, specific kind, naming exact failures and their consequences. Clement Hale had, in the fall of 1868, been approached by a group of men who called themselves a land consortium. They had offered him a significant sum of money to provide documentation, not to falsify it, he was careful to write, but to look the other way while others falsified it. Survey records, boundary claims, transfer documents for homesteads whose owners had recently died or moved on, or been convinced to sell under terms that weren't entirely voluntary. He had taken their money. Once. One payment. And then he had looked at what he had made possible, and he had not been able to live with it. He had tried to undo it through official channels. The official channels had not been interested. One of the men who headed the consortium was closely connected to the county land office. When Clement had threatened to go wider, to the territorial authorities, a man he didn't recognize had come to the ranch while Gideon's mother was away at market, and explained with considerable clarity what would happen to Clement's family if he continued on that path. So he had run. Not for himself, the letter said. Or not only for himself, and Gideon read that parenthetical caveat with a complicated feeling that was neither forgiveness nor its opposite. He had run to collect the evidence he'd been accumulating quietly for months, evidence that documented the full scope of what the consortium had done. He had intended to get that evidence to someone who could use it, and then come home. He had not come home because the evidence was harder to secure than he'd anticipated, and because the men who didn't want it found kept finding his trail, and because somewhere along the way the years had accumulated around him like snow, and he'd become afraid in a way he hadn't expected, not of the men hunting him, but of what his son's face would look like when he came home. The letter said, I am a coward in more ways than I ever admitted to myself. The men who stole that land were criminals, and I helped them, and I have spent 11 years trying to find some way to undo what I set in motion. I don't know if the evidence I gathered means anything still. I don't know if the men responsible are still alive or still powerful. But I couldn't die without telling you where to find it, because you deserve to know the truth, and because maybe, if any part of my work was worth anything, it can still do some good. The final page gave an address, not an address exactly, but a set of landmarks, a dry riverbed, a split cottonwood, a distance and a direction from a specific rock formation near a place called Ridgecroft Canyon. Gideon read it twice and folded it back up. Did he tell you what's in the documents? He asked. He told me enough. Eliza had her hands folded on the table. land records, fraudulent transfers, evidence that a group of men used forged documentation to claim title to homesteads that were legally occupied. He said the original deeds were hidden in the location he described because he couldn't get them out of the territory and he couldn't risk them being found. How many homesteads? She hesitated. He said 14, maybe more. He wasn't certain of the full count. 14 families. Gideon sat with that number. 14 families who'd built something on a piece of ground and then lost it through paperwork they never even knew existed, through a transaction that happened in some back room while they were out planting or calving or putting their children to bed. Who were the men? He asked. He only named 2 in what he told me. He said the letters would name the rest. She paused. One of them was a man named Aldous Crane. Gideon set his coffee cup down on the table carefully. Aldous Crane currently owned the largest cattle operation in Harlan County. He had a house in town that took up half a block, a pew at the front of the church, and the sheriff on what everyone in the county understood to be a comfortable, informal arrangement. He was 60 years old, and he had the air of a man who had been so thoroughly accustomed to getting what he wanted that the concept of opposition had begun to feel theoretical to him. You understand, Gideon said slowly, that if what my father wrote is true, and if those documents are where he said they are, then what I do with this information will make some very powerful men very dangerous. Yes. And you're telling me anyway? I promised your father I would. He looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing furtive in her expression, nothing that suggested she was doing arithmetic behind her eyes while they talked. She'd delivered what she came to deliver. She was waiting to see what he'd do with it. I told you you'd have a meal, Gideon said finally. And it's late. The room at the end of the hall is empty. You can take it tonight and ride the stage back to Cooperville tomorrow morning if you want. That's generous. It's practical. I need to think, and I can't think well if I'm worried about a woman walking 17 miles back to town in the dark. Something that was almost a smile moved across her face. Not warm exactly, more like the recognition of a person who says what they mean. I'll stay the night. Thank you. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his father's letter and a lamp turned low and went through it again, more slowly, marking the passages that named specifics. Names, dates, the sequence of events as Clement had understood them. He cross-referenced it against his own memory. The things he'd noticed in 1868 that he hadn't had a framework for at the time. The way certain families in the northern part of the county had quietly stopped being there. The Lundqvist homestead that had been absorbed into the Crane operation by 1870 with an explanation no one quite examined. The Pauley brothers' place, the Wheatfield claim, 3 others he could think of off the top of his head that had simply changed hands, during a period when changing hands wasn't unusual enough to draw sustained attention. He hadn't drawn the connection then. He'd been 22, 23, running a ranch with a missing father and a grieving mother, keeping his head below the horizon line. He drew it now. By the time the lamp started guttering, he had the outline of something he didn't entirely want to have. A picture that was coherent and ugly, and if his father's letter was accurate, documented somewhere at the bottom of a canyon 60 miles from here. He heard her moving in the hallway before she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was still dressed, hadn't slept either, or hadn't undressed for it. You're still up, she said. Not a question. So are you. She came to the table and looked at the letter and the notes he'd made around it without touching any of it. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. He looked up at her. What did he tell you about the location? Beyond what's in the letter. She sat down across from him. Same chair as dinner, same steady posture. He described the canyon. He said he'd found a natural chamber in the east face, behind a rock shelf that looked like a solid wall but wasn't. He'd wrapped the documents in oilskin before he cached them. She paused. He said he went back twice to check on them and they were still there. The second time was 4 years ago. 4 years is a long time. He knew that. Crane's men have had this territory for over a decade. If they ever figured out what Clement was doing, he thought they didn't. He thought they believed he'd been killed in the first year. She met his eyes. He might have been wrong. He might have been wrong, Gideon agreed. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the horses were restless with something. A coyote passing at a distance, probably. Gideon listened to them settle. Why did he trust you? He asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a question he needed to understand the answer to. Eliza was quiet for a moment. My father homesteaded in this territory. He lost his land, not to Crane directly, but through the same kind of mechanism your father described. Forged transfer papers. He didn't know how to fight it, and by the time he figured out he needed to, the legal window had closed. She said it flatly, without emphasis. Your father found out about my family's situation through a man he trusted in Fort Callum. He came to us. He spent 2 years helping my father build a case. He wasn't able to get my father's land back before he died, but he was trying. Gideon took this in. So you came here, he said, because of what he did for your family. I came here because I promised him, but yes, because of what he did. She looked at the letter. He talked about you a great deal. He was afraid you'd think less of him. Gideon didn't say anything. He said you were harder on yourself than anyone deserved to be, she added. He said it came from him. Gideon pushed back from the table and stood up and went to the window. The yard was dark, the outbuildings just shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the open land. He stood there for a while with his back to her. I'm going to go find those documents, he said. I thought you might. It's not safe. Crane's people are still watching the canyon. I know. I'm not asking you to come. I know that too. A pause. But I know what your father told me about the location, and you have the letter, which is incomplete without the verbal description he gave me. And I've been looking for a way to do something useful with what happened to my family for a long time. Her voice was matter of fact, not pleading, not performing bravery, just stating the facts as she understood them. You'd be better off with me along. He turned from the window and looked at her. She was right, and he knew it, and he didn't entirely like knowing it, which was a feeling he recognized from many years of working alongside people who were competent at things he wasn't. He'd learned, over time, to mistrust that discomfort. It usually pointed towards something worth doing. We leave at first light, he said. You'll need to borrow a horse, and better boots than those. She looked down at her boots. What's wrong with my boots? The sole's separating on the left one. I noticed when you walked in. She looked up at him. You notice a lot. It's a survival habit. He woke Remy before sunrise and told him a shortened version of the situation. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Remy listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Gideon valued most about him. When Gideon finished, Remy was quiet for a moment. This about your father? He asked. Partly. And the other part? 14 families that lost their land to fraudulent paperwork. Remy chewed on this. In the lamplight, his face was deeply lined and entirely unreadable, the way it got when he was doing his own kind of slow arithmetic. Crane's people are going to hear about this before you get back. Probably. They'll try to use it against you here. Say you've gone soft. Let some stranger talk you into something foolish. Let them say it. Remy nodded slowly. I'll keep the place together while you're gone. You want me to send word to anyone? Not yet. Nobody knows anything yet. Gideon paused. If we're not back in 10 days, send word to the Territorial Land Office in Albuquerque, not the county, the Territorial. Understood. Gideon saddled his horse in the pre-dawn quiet, listening to the ranch settle and breathe around him. He'd been born here. He'd grown up moving through these sounds. The way the boards of the barn creaked in the cold, the particular quality of silence before a working day started, the steady drip from the trough when the pipe ran in wet weather. He'd built his adult life in the grooves his father had worn into this place, following the same rhythms without knowing whether he was honoring them or hiding in them. Eliza came out of the house in borrowed boots, a pair of his mother's old riding boots that were slightly too large and that she'd stuffed with an extra pair of wool socks. Carrying her satchel and looking like someone who had already moved past the part of the morning where uncertainty was relevant. Ready? She said. He looked at her for a moment. The sky behind the ridge was just beginning to separate into layers of dark. No, he said honestly, but let's go anyway. She didn't smile at that. But something in her expression acknowledged it. The small, honest accounting of a feeling named out loud instead of buried. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the bay mare he'd saddled for her with the ease of someone who'd ridden hard country before. They rode out through the front gate as the first color came into the east. Behind them, the Hale Ranch settled back into its morning routine, unchanged on the surface. The horses shifting in the pasture, Remy starting his rounds, smoke beginning to come from the bunkhouse chimney. Somewhere in the direction they were heading, buried in rock and oilskin and 11 years of silence, there were documents that could destroy men who had spent those 11 years making themselves untouchable. Gideon rode with his father's letter in his breast pocket, folded against his chest, and thought about a 17-year-old boy who had watched his father ride away into a fall morning and had never been given a reason. He had one now. He wasn't sure yet whether it helped. The road to Ridgecroft Canyon ran southeast through country that got progressively less forgiving the farther you went. Good grazing land giving way to scrub and hard pan, then to broken terrain where the rock pushed up through the soil like old bones. Gideon had ridden this direction maybe a dozen times over the years, never past the 20-mile mark. Beyond that, the land belonged to no one in any practical sense, which was to say it belonged to whoever was willing to be unpleasant about it. They made camp the first night near a shallow creek that still had some run to it despite the dry season. Eliza gathered wood without being asked, built the fire low and efficient, the way people did when they'd spent time in open country, and understood that a big fire was an announcement. Gideon noticed this without commenting on it. They ate salt pork and hard biscuits and drank coffee that was too strong because Gideon had measured for his own taste without thinking about having company. Eliza drank it without complaint. "Tell me about the men your father named," she said. "Beyond Crane." He named a man called Virgil Moss in the letter. Ran the county land office during the period when the transfers happened. He's dead now. Died in '74, drinking. Gideon poured the last of the coffee. And a lawyer named Prentice, Harlan Prentice. He still practices out of Cooperville. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Prentice drew up my father's supposed sale agreement, the one my father never signed. I figured it might be something like that. She stared into the fire. He came to the house, sat at our table. My mother gave him coffee. Her voice was level, but her jaw was tight. He told my father the documents were in order, that the previous transaction had been legally recorded. He said it with such... She stopped. He said it like my father was the one who'd made an error, like we were the confused ones. That's what made it work, Gideon said. Men like Prentice understand that most people will doubt themselves before they'll doubt a lawyer with papers. My father doubted himself for 2 years before he found someone who told him the truth. She looked up from the fire. Your father told him the truth. It cost your father something to do that. I want you to know I understood that, even then. Gideon didn't answer right away. The fire popped and settled. Somewhere in the dark, something moved through the brush. Deer, probably, working toward the creek. My father made his choices, he said finally. Some of them were bad ones. He said so himself. He set his cup down. But he spent 11 years trying to undo them, and that's worth something. I'm still working out how much. They found the first abandoned cabin on the second afternoon, 3 miles off the main track where Clement's letter had directed them through a series of landmarks that Eliza supplemented with details from memory. The cabin had been empty long enough that the roof had begun to buckle inward on the east side, and the kitchen garden was entirely reclaimed by scrub, but the bones of the place were solid, good timber construction, a stone foundation, the kind of building that someone had put care into. Gideon pulled up outside it and sat his horse for a moment. Whose was this? Eliza asked. Letter says a family named Kessler. Came out from Illinois in '66. The father died of a snakebite in '69, and the widow was told, through Prentice apparently, that her husband had taken a loan against the land she didn't know about, that the land had been collateral, that the loan was called in after his death. He looked at the empty windows. She had 3 children. She went to live with her sister in Amarillo. Eliza looked at the cabin for a long time. The loan didn't exist. According to my father, no. It was created after the fact, backdated. Moss filed the paperwork at the land office and Prentice provided the supporting documentation, and Crane absorbed the acreage into his eastern holdings inside of 6 months. And nobody asked questions. People asked questions. They just asked them of the sheriff, and the sheriff asked Crane, and Crane said everything was in order, and that was where the questions ended. Gideon turned his horse back toward the track. 14 times. They didn't speak again for several miles. The land around them got rougher, the track narrowing until it was barely a path, overgrown at the edges with sage and scrub oak. The canyon was visible now as a dark notch against the ridgeline to the southeast, still distant but taking on definition as the afternoon wore on. They made camp in a shallow draw that offered cover from the high ground, and Gideon spent an hour before dark glassing the canyon approach with the small telescope he'd brought, looking for movement, for horses, for any sign that the ground ahead had been visited recently. He didn't find anything obvious. That was only mildly reassuring. Your father said Crane's men came through the canyon twice that he knew of, Eliza said, watching him scan. The first time was in 1870. The second was in 1875. He watched them from a position above. They were searching, but not systematically. He thought they were looking for him, not for the cache. By 1875, they might have given up on finding him alive, Gideon said. If they thought he was dead, they might not have known there was anything to look for. That's what he believed. Or they found the cache and cleaned it out, and there's nothing left. He went back in 1878, and it was still there. That's 4 years ago. He lowered the telescope. A lot changes in 4 years. Yes, she said simply. It does. The trouble found them before the canyon did. They were an hour out from camp the next morning, picking their way along a dry creek bed according to the letter's directions, when Gideon heard horses on the ridge above them, not the casual sound of passing riders, but the deliberate positioned sound of men who had stopped moving and were watching something below. He pulled up and held a fist out, and Eliza stopped behind him without asking why. 3 seconds. 5. Ridge. 11 o'clock, he said quietly. Don't look. How many? Can't tell. At least 2, maybe 3. Cranes? This far out, who else? He turned his horse slowly, not hurrying, the way you moved when you wanted to look like a man who'd simply changed his mind about his direction. Eliza matched his pace exactly. They rode at a walk back down the creek bed for 200 yards before the terrain gave them a cut bank to duck behind, and then Gideon was out of the saddle and up the bank on foot with the telescope before Eliza had finished tying off the horses. 2 men on the ridge, both armed. One of them was Chet Arlo. Gideon recognized the particular size of him, the large gray horse. Arlo was Crane's range foreman, a man Gideon had dealt with twice in boundary disputes and found to be precise, humorless, and entirely comfortable with implicit threat. The second man he didn't know. Arlo, he said, when he slid back down the bank. Eliza's expression changed, not into fear exactly, but into a kind of sharpened attention. He's Crane's man. His foreman. He's been watching this creek bed. Gideon looked at the horses, then at the terrain ahead. Which means someone told him we were coming this way. Who knew we were going to the canyon? Remy. A pause. And nobody else, unless someone saw us leave and made some fast guesses about direction. He thought it through. We didn't tell anyone in Cooperville. I didn't speak to anyone. She looked at him steadily. Neither did you. We rode through before sunup. Then either they've been watching the canyon approaches regularly, or... He stopped. Or Remy told someone, she finished. He didn't want to say yes to that. Remy had been with him for 14 years. Remy had been with his father before that. But Remy was also 60 years old in a county where Aldous Crane could make life very comfortable or very difficult depending on his mood. And Gideon had left him alone on the ranch with no explanation and a 10-day deadline. We need to move, Gideon said. Different route. The letter's route is the only one I know well enough. Then describe what your father told you about the canyon's interior, as much as you remember. She did, while they moved, picking their way through broken country that wasn't any path at all, just terrain they could use. Eliza talked steadily and precisely, describing the east face of the canyon, the shape of the rock shelf, the way the shadow fell at midday when the light came down direct. Her father had drawn her a rough map from memory of what Clement had described to him, and she'd memorized it before leaving Fort Callum. "The shelf looks solid," she said. "That's what your father told mine. You'd walk past it a dozen times and see nothing, but there's a gap at the north end, behind a standing column of rock, not wide enough to ride through, but a man can get in on foot with a little work. You'd think after 11 years Crane's men would have found it." Your father thought the same thing. He thought the size of the canyon worked in his favor. It's nearly 2 miles end to end, and the east face is the wrong face to search if you're coming in from the west, which is the natural approach. She paused to get her footing on a loose slope. He hid it well. He had time to hide it well. They circled wide around the ridge where Arlo's men had been, losing 2 hours to the detour. When they finally came down into the canyon from the north, a route that required a careful descent through a cleft in the rock that neither of them mentioned being uncertain about, the late afternoon light was turning the stone walls amber and rose. The canyon was bigger than Gideon had expected. The walls rose 40, 50 feet in places, cutting the sky into a crooked strip of blue overhead. The floor was sand and gravel, a dry stream bed running down the center, scattered with boulders that had come down off the walls over decades. It smelled like dust and sage and sun-heated rock, not unpleasant, but ancient in a way that made the sound of their horses' hooves feel intrusive. "East face," Eliza said. They tied the horses in the shadow of a large boulder near the north entrance and went on foot. Gideon had his rifle across his back and one hand near his revolver without actually touching it, moving by habit rather than decided intention. The east face was in shade now, the sun having passed the canyon's apex, and the rock was a dark reddish-brown, shot through with lines of paler stone. "Standing column," he said. "Should be farther south, maybe a quarter mile." They found it 18 minutes later. A freestanding pillar of rock, maybe 12 feet high, leaned against the main wall in a way that looked geological and random, which it was, and also happened to create exactly the kind of concealment Clement had described. Gideon squeezed past it first, turning sideways, the rock face cold through his shirt even in the day's heat. Behind the column, the wall face revealed a gap, a horizontal crack in the rock face, wider than it looked from outside, running back into shadow. Gideon crouched and put his arm in up to the shoulder and found nothing but air, and then, further back, the cold flat surface of the floor extending inward. "There's a space," he said. He went in on hands and knees. Eliza followed. Inside, the space opened up enough to crouch in. A natural pocket in the rock, roughly 10 feet deep and 6 across, entirely invisible from the canyon floor. The light that filtered in from the entrance was dim but sufficient. In the far corner, wrapped in oilskin and weighted down with 2 flat stones, was the cache. Gideon sat back on his heels and looked at it for a moment without touching it. 11 years. A man's last effort to do one thing right after doing one thing catastrophically wrong. He thought about his father riding out on a fall morning and not coming back, and his mother at the window, and the way the ranch had felt in those first years afterward, like a place with a room in it that nobody was allowed to go near. He picked it up. The oilskin was intact. The knots were Clement's work. He recognized the particular over-under pattern his father had used for everything, same as he'd taught Gideon when Gideon was 8 years old, and didn't yet understand that a knot could be a signature. His hands worked carefully, not rushing. Inside were 3 separate bundles of documents, each wrapped again in oilskin. Survey records, transfer paperwork, a ledger, its pages stiff with age but legible, showing transactions alongside names and dates and dollar amounts. And at the bottom, a sheaf of correspondence, letters, some of them in Clement's handwriting, some in hands Gideon didn't recognize, building the chain of communication between Crane, Moss, and Prentice across a period of nearly 4 years. "Is it all here?" Eliza asked from behind him. "I don't know yet, but it's substantial." He turned one page carefully. "This alone." He stopped. One of the letters was from Crane directly, naming 3 of the homesteads by the surnames of their owners and discussing their acquisition as though they were livestock transactions. Casual, completely without concern, the language of a man who has never seriously considered that anyone would hold him to account. "This is enough." He was rewrapping the documents when they both heard it. Boots on gravel, somewhere outside the column. More than one set. Gideon looked at Eliza. She'd already heard it. Her hand had gone to the small knife she carried at her belt. Not a fighting weapon, just a tool, but it was what she had, and she had it. "How many ways out of this pocket?" he said quietly. "One," she said. Outside, a voice said, "Arlo, look here. Fresh boot prints." Gideon tucked the documents back into the satchel Eliza had brought, the one that had carried his father's letter, and pulled the strap across his chest. Then he pressed his back against the far wall of the pocket and looked at the entrance and thought about the geometry of what came next. It was not a comfortable set of thoughts, but he'd ridden into this canyon knowing that the possibility existed, and he'd come anyway, and whatever happened in the next few minutes would happen on terms he'd chosen rather than terms that had been chosen for him. There was something in that, even if he couldn't have said precisely what. Eliza crouched beside him. She was breathing steadily. Not calm, he could see the tension in her jaw, the controlled effort of it, but controlled. The difference between frightened and undone. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'm not going to argue about it right now," she said, "but we should discuss your general habit of deciding things unilaterally." Despite everything, he almost laughed. The boots crunched closer on the gravel outside. Chet Arlo was not a man who announced himself. That was the thing about him that made him dangerous. He didn't bluster, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things that gave you a half-second of warning before something went bad. He simply appeared in the entrance of the rock pocket with his revolver already drawn, his large frame blocking most of the available light, and said, "Set it down, Hale." Behind him, partially visible in the gap between the standing column and the wall, was the second man. Younger, holding a rifle across his body, watching the approach angles the way someone had taught him to. Gideon didn't set anything down. He stood with the satchel across his chest and his right hand at his side, 3 feet from his revolver, and unwilling to close that distance with a gun already pointed at him. Eliza was behind his left shoulder, which was where he'd told her to be, and he could feel her stillness back there like a held breath. "Arlo," Gideon said, "you're a long way from your ranch." "So are you." Arlo's eyes moved to the satchel. He was a practical man and a methodical one. He'd assessed the situation the moment he'd come through the gap, and he understood what it meant that Gideon was holding a bag in a place where something had been hidden for a very long time. "Mr. Crane's going to want to know what you found in here." "I imagine he is." "Hand it over and we ride back together. Nice and simple." "And if I don't?" Arlo looked at him with the flat patience of a man who had resolved similar conversations before and understood that the resolution didn't always require extensive discussion. "Then it gets complicated." Gideon's mind was working fast and narrow, the way it did in moments that didn't allow for breadth. The pocket had one exit. Arlo had that exit covered. The second man outside had the approach angle. Even if Gideon cleared his holster before Arlo fired, which was not a certainty, Eliza was directly in the line of whatever came next, in an enclosed space with nowhere to go. He'd been in bad positions before. This one had a specific quality of bad that he didn't enjoy. "Those documents belong to the families whose land was taken," Eliza said from behind him. Her voice was steady, not aggressive, not shaking, just clear, the way a person spoke when they were past the point of being afraid of how they sounded. "They're not Crane's property. They never were." Arlo glanced at her briefly, the way a man glanced at a door that had spoken. "Miss, I don't know who you are or what you've been told, but you do well to let the men talk." "The men," she said, seemed to be at a standstill. "So." Something moved in Arlo's jaw. Not amusement. Arlo didn't do amusement as far as Gideon had ever seen, but the recognition of an unexpected variable. He refocused on Gideon. "Last time," he said. Gideon made a decision. It was not a fully considered decision. There wasn't time for that. But it came from a place that felt solid, which was the best he could do. He'd rather make a move on his own terms than wait for Arlo to make one on his. "Eliza," he said quietly, "when I move, you go for the gap. Don't stop." "Gideon, don't argue." He threw the satchel. Not at Arlo, sideways, hard, toward the wall to Arlo's right. The movement was fast and without obvious intent, which made it confusing for a half-second in a situation where half-seconds mattered. Arlo's eyes tracked the satchel involuntarily, and in that half-second, Gideon crossed the distance between himself and Arlo, not reaching for his gun, but reaching for Arlo's wrist, both hands, redirecting the revolver toward the ceiling as it went off, the shot deafeningly loud in the enclosed rock space. The muzzle flashed close enough that Gideon felt the heat of it against his forearm. He heard Eliza move. What followed was neither graceful nor decisive. It was a close-quarters fight between two large men in a space too small for it, and Gideon took an elbow across the jaw that turned his vision white for a moment, and Arlo took a knee to the ribs that bent him but didn't break him, and they went sideways into the rock wall, together with enough force to knock the breath out of both of them. Gideon got Arlo's gun hand pinned against the rock and held it there, his own face pressed into the stone beside it, both of them breathing hard and neither of them winning. "Let go," Arlo said. His voice was flat, even now. "You first," Gideon said into the rock. A shot cracked from outside. Then another. Then silence of a different quality than before. Arlo went still. Gideon went still. They held the position for a full 3 seconds, both of them listening. Eliza's voice came from outside the gap. "I have your man's rifle. He's sitting down now." Gideon became aware of the pain in his jaw and the taste of blood where his cheek had caught the wall. He kept Arlo's wrist pinned and turned his head enough to see Arlo's face, the calculation moving through it, the arithmetic of 2 men down and 1 woman outside with a rifle, and the geometry of the situation reorganizing around a new conclusion. "Step back," Gideon said. Slowly. Arlo stepped back. Gideon took the revolver. They tied Arlo and the younger man, who turned out to be named Webb, a recent hire who hadn't been in the territory long enough to understand fully what he'd signed on for, to a pair of boulders near the canyon's north entrance, with enough rope to be uncomfortable but not dangerous. Arlo submitted to this with the composure of a man filing a grievance that he intended to pursue through proper channels later. Webb looked considerably less composed. "Crane's gonna know you have them," Arlo said, watching Gideon check the knots. "You know that." "I expect so. He's got 3 more men between here and Cooperville. They'll be watching the roads." "I appreciate you telling me that." Arlo's expression didn't change. "I'm not telling you to help you. I'm telling you so you understand the size of what you've stepped into." Gideon stood up and looked at him. Arlo was in his mid-50s, had worked Crane's land for over a decade, had done the work of a man who understood that his employer operated outside the edges of legality and had made his accommodation with that understanding. There was no great menace in his face right now, just the closed-down look of a man who'd lost a round and was recalculating. "You've known what Crane did," Gideon said, "all this time." "I work cattle," Arlo said. "What my employer does with paperwork isn't my concern. 14 families lost their land. I don't know anything about any of that." "You will," Gideon said. "When those documents get to Albuquerque, everyone in this county will." He left Arlo to think about that and went back to where Eliza was standing with the rifle, a Winchester, newer than his own, which she was holding with the casual competence of someone who'd used one before. The younger man, Webb, was sitting against his boulder with his hat off and his hands tied behind him, and an expression that said he was reconsidering his life choices. "You said don't argue," Eliza said when Gideon came up to her. "You didn't say anything about the man outside. How'd you get the rifle off him?" "He was watching the pocket entrance and not watching me come around the back of the column." She handed the Winchester back to him. "He made assumptions. People do that. I've noticed." Her hands were shaking slightly now. Not badly, just the fine tremor of adrenaline finding somewhere to go after the fact. She pressed them against her thighs and didn't mention it, and he didn't mention it either, because there was nothing useful to say about it, and they both had the same tremor, and both understood what it was. "We need to move," he said. "Arlo said there are men on the roads between here and Cooperville." "Do you believe him?" "I believe he's not trying to help us, which means that information either isn't true or it's true, and he told us because he thinks it won't matter." He picked up the satchel from where it had landed against the wall, checked the documents were still secure. "I'd rather plan like it's true." "What's the alternative to the roads?" "There's a route north through the ridge country, longer, rougher, But it comes out within 10 miles of the ranch, and from there we can cut across to Cooperville without touching the main roads at all. He looked at the sky above the canyon walls. The light was low, an hour of it left. We ride tonight, but they rode through country that didn't want to be ridden at night. Rock faces and sudden drops, ground that looked solid and shifted, animals that moved at the edge of the horse's vision and set both animals on edge in ways that required constant management. Gideon rode ahead, and Eliza followed his line without complaint, though he could hear her horse stumbling twice in draws she couldn't fully see. They didn't talk much. The terrain required attention, and there was nothing they needed to say that couldn't wait until the terrain permitted it. But around midnight, when they stopped to rest the horses near a spring that Gideon had used years before on a stray cattle search, Eliza said, "What are you going to do when we get back?" "Take the documents to Cooperville. Find a lawyer who isn't Prentice. There's a woman in Cooperville named Aldred. She's not a lawyer, but she has connections to the Territorial Land Office. She helped my father make initial contact before he died. She'd know who to go to." "You've thought about this." "I had 17 miles to think on the way to your ranch." She was sitting on a flat rock near the spring, her hat off, her hair coming half loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked tired in a way that the dark made easier to see. The lines around her eyes, the set of a jaw that had been held tight for a long time. "I've been thinking about it for longer than that, if I'm being honest. Ever since your father told me what he'd found." "Why didn't you go to Albuquerque yourself? You didn't need me for that." She was quiet for a moment. "Without the original documents, I'm a woman from Fort Callum telling a story about land fraud based on what a dying man said. The documents needed the letter, and the letter needed to go to you. Your father was very clear about that." She paused. "And the men who could be identified by those documents are the same men who've been making life difficult for anyone who got too close to the truth. Going to Albuquerque alone, without something solid," she shook her head. "I'd have had the same conversation my father had with the county authorities. Very polite, very thorough, completely useless." Gideon thought about that. He thought about his father making the same calculation 11 years ago and running instead of fighting, and what it had cost him and everyone around him. "We're not going to be quiet about this," he said. "When we get back. I want you to understand that. It's going to get loud before it gets resolved, and Crane has more resources than we do and more men who owe him things." "I understand that. Your name will be attached to it. People in Cooperville will say things about you." "They already say things about me." She put her hat back on. "I've been the daughter of the man who lost his land to a fake contract for 15 years. I'm used to being the person people talk around." He looked at her in the dark. What he could see of her, the shape of her, the particular stillness she had that he'd been noticing since the first night in his kitchen. There was nothing soft about Eliza Rowan in the way that people usually meant when they called a woman soft. But there was something in her that was solid in the way good timber was solid. Not rigid, not brittle, but the kind of thing you could build on if you had to. He'd been building on bad ground his whole adult life without knowing it. The uncertainty of what his father was, what his father had done, what the ranch itself had been built alongside. He hadn't known the ground was bad. That was the thing. He thought the uncertainty was just the general condition of being alive, of having a father who was gone and questions that had no answers. Now he had answers. They were not easy answers, but they were real ones. "My father was afraid I'd think less of him," he said. Not to her particularly, more like saying it out loud to hear whether it still hurt. "I don't. I should probably be clear about that." He looked at his hands. "I'm angry at him. I'm angry he left. I'm angry about what it did to my mother, but I don't think less of him for trying to fix it." Eliza didn't say anything immediately. When she did speak, she said, "He knew you were angry. He said you had a right to be." He wasn't wrong about that. He also said that anger was one of the things he missed about you, that you felt things too hard to pretend otherwise. A pause. He meant it as a compliment. Gideon looked at the spring, the small, dark gleam of water moving over rock. "We should keep riding." "Yes," she said. "We should." Bond. They came down out of the ridge country in the gray pre-dawn and hit the flatland north of the Hale Ranch with both horses badly in need of rest, and both riders not much better. The ranch came into view as the sky began to separate. The dark shape of the barn, the house, smoke already coming from the bunkhouse chimney. Remy was waiting at the gate, not waiting like a man who'd been keeping watch, waiting like a man who hadn't slept and had spent the night going back and forth about something and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't comfortable with. He was standing outside the gate with his hat in his hand when they rode up, and when Gideon pulled his horse to a stop, Remy looked at him with the expression of a man about to say something that cost him something. "Someone came yesterday," Remy said. "One of Crane's men. Name of Fetters. He told me Crane wanted to talk to you, said it was friendly, said there might be compensation available for anyone who provided information about your whereabouts." He stopped. "I told him I hadn't seen you in 2 days and didn't know where you'd gone." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. "That's the truth." "Yes, it is." Remy's jaw worked. "He offered me money, Gideon. I want you to know that because I want you to know I turned it down, but I also want you to know it was more money than I've seen in a long time, and I'm not a rich man, and I told him to get off my property anyway." "Your property?" "This ranch is my property too," Remy said, with a sharpness that was not hostility but something closer to pride. 14 years of work. I've got more invested in this ground than Crane has in any piece of paper he's ever filed." Gideon got down from his horse. He was stiff, and his jaw had turned purple where Arlo's elbow had landed, and he probably looked like a man who'd had a difficult 48 hours, which he had. He walked to the gate and put his hand on Remy's shoulder briefly. "I know," he said. Remy looked at the satchel across Gideon's chest, then at Eliza still mounted behind him, then back at Gideon's face. "You found it." "We found it." "Is it enough?" Gideon thought about the ledger, the letters, the forged transfer papers with Crane's name on them and Moss's signature and Prentice's seal. He thought about the 14 families. He thought about the Kessler cabin with its caved-in roof and its reclaimed kitchen garden and its 3 children who'd grown up somewhere else. "It'll have to be," he said. Inside the house, he set the satchel on the kitchen table, the same table where Eliza had sat 3 days ago delivering a dead man's message, where he'd sat alone that first night reading his father's handwriting by a low lamp. He looked at the table and the satchel on it and the woman standing across from him with road dust on her coat and someone else's borrowed boots on her feet. "We leave for Cooperville at noon," he said, "after the horses rest. And if Crane's men are watching the road, then they'll see us coming and they'll have to decide what to do about that." He pulled his hat off and set it on the chair. "Arlo told me Crane has resources." "He does. But resources and right aren't the same thing, and they don't always land on the same side." Eliza looked at him. "That's either wisdom or stubbornness." "Probably both," he said. "Go sleep for 3 hours. I'll have coffee ready when you wake up." She went down the hall without arguing, which told him she was more exhausted than she'd shown. He stood in the kitchen alone for a moment with the satchel in front of him, and he thought about his father riding out on a fall morning with papers in a bag and a plan that hadn't gone the way he'd intended. Some things ran in families. He put water on to boil and sat down to wait. The road to Cooperville was empty in the way that roads were empty when someone had cleared them on purpose. Gideon noticed it within the first 3 miles. No freight wagons, no riders heading into town for supplies, none of the ordinary morning traffic that a road this size should have carried on a weekday. The absence of it had a quality that was different from simple quietness. It felt managed. "Someone told them we'd be coming this way," Eliza said. She'd been riding beside him for the last mile and had been watching the road with the same attention he had. "Or Arlo got loose earlier than I planned for." "How long did you give the knots?" 6 hours. Maybe 8 if he couldn't reach the rock edge. He scanned the tree line on the left side of the road without moving his head noticeably. "We've been riding 4. She didn't say anything to that. They both understood the arithmetic. The trouble came at the bridge crossing 2 miles outside of Cooperville, a low wooden bridge over a creek that ran shallow this time of year, the only crossing for 4 miles in either direction unless you knew the ford upstream, which Gideon did and which he'd been considering since they left the ranch. 3 men on horseback were positioned on the far side of the bridge, spread wide enough to cover the approach. One of them Gideon recognized as Fetters, the man who'd come to the ranch looking for Remy's cooperation. The other 2 he didn't know by name, but he knew the type. Hired muscle that Crane kept on rotation, men without particular loyalty to anything except the current paycheck. Gideon pulled up 20 yards short of the bridge. "That's far enough, Hale," Fetters called across. He was a compact man with a neatly trimmed beard that looked incongruous with everything else about him. "Mr. Crane would like a word." "Crane can come find me himself," Gideon said. "I'm not in the habit of conducting business through intermediaries on public roads. This road isn't as public as you might think. Every road in this county is public. That's the law." He kept his voice even. "You're welcome to verify that with the territorial office in Albuquerque. I'm planning to visit them shortly so I could pass along any questions you have." Something shifted in Fetter's posture at the word Albuquerque. Not much, just the small recalibration of a man who'd been given a job without being told all the relevant details of what might complicate it. Gideon used that half second. He turned his horse left off the road at a walk, unhurried, angling into the tree line as though he'd simply decided to take a different route. Eliza matched him immediately. Behind them, he heard Fetters say something to the other two men, heard the horses start to move, and then he and Eliza were into the trees and he pushed the horse from walk to canter without ceremony. The ford was a quarter-mile upstream through uneven ground. Not fast ground, but ground he knew, which was the only advantage he had. He heard the men behind them crashing through brush, heard one horse stumble and a man curse, heard them spread to try to flank. He kept to the line he knew and trusted it. They came out at the ford at a run, water spraying up under the horses' hooves, the creek cold and shallow and no obstacle at all. And then they were up the far bank and onto the back road that came into Cooperville from the north, and Gideon pushed the pace until the buildings of town came into sight. He didn't slow down until they were on the main street. Fetters and his men didn't follow them into town. That was informative. It meant Crane hadn't yet made a decision about how public he was willing to let this become. In town, there were witnesses. Witnesses complicated things. Crane had spent a long time keeping this particular set of complications contained, and riding armed men into Cooperville's main street in broad daylight was not containment. It was, Gideon thought, probably the last piece of open ground they'd have before everything closed in. But Clara Aldred ran a dry goods business on the east end of Cooperville's main street that was considerably more than a dry goods business. Eliza had described her on the ride as a woman who'd spent 30 years accumulating the kind of influence that didn't get titles or offices but got things done, and who had connections to the territorial land office through a brother-in-law who'd worked there for 2 decades. She was 64, broad-shouldered, and she was standing behind her counter when they walked in as though she'd been expecting them. She looked at Eliza first. "You're back." "I found what Clement Hale hid," Eliza said. "We have the documents." Clara's eyes moved to Gideon. They were sharp eyes, not particularly warm, the eyes of a woman who had learned to assess people quickly because she'd been wrong about them before and intended to be wrong less often. "You're his son." "Gideon Hale." "You look like him." She came around the counter and turned the sign on the door to closed without explanation. "Sit down, both of you. Show me what you have." He spread the documents on her counter. The ledger first, then the transfer paperwork, then the correspondence. Clara put on her reading glasses and worked through them methodically, taking her time, not speaking. Gideon watched her face. She was good at not showing what she was thinking, but she wasn't perfect. Her jaw tightened when she found the letter with Crane's name on it, and her hand went still on the ledger when she reached the page that listed the Rowan family's property among the transactions. She took off her glasses after 20 minutes. "This is enough," she said. "To do what exactly?" Gideon asked. "To bring a case before the Territorial Land Commission. To initiate an investigation into fraudulent transfers." She tapped the ledger. "This document alone establishes a pattern across 4 years and names the principals. Combined with the correspondence..." She stopped. "Harlan Prentice is going to prison." "I've been waiting a long time to say those words." "Crane too?" "Crane too. His name is on 3 of these letters in his own hand. He may try to claim the letters were forged, but combined with the ledger entries and the transfer documentation..." She shook her head. "He'd need a better lawyer than this county can produce, and a judge who hadn't seen these papers." Eliza was sitting on the edge of the counter stool with her hands folded in her lap. She'd been very quiet since they walked in. Now she said, "The families, the ones who lost their land." Is there any possibility of restitution? Clara looked at her. Something in the older woman's expression changed, not softened exactly, but acknowledged something it hadn't before. Some of them. The ones where the original deeds are in this bundle and the transfers can be shown to be fraudulent? Yes. The Land Commission can void the transfers. It's not a guarantee and it's not fast, and for families who've moved on and rebuilt elsewhere, getting the land back doesn't undo what was lost. She paused. But it means they were right. It means the record says they were right. That counts for something. It counts for a great deal, Eliza said quietly. Clara sent a telegram to Albuquerque within the hour, not through the Cooperville telegraph office, which she didn't trust, but through a man who rode to the next town with the message in his coat pocket. She also made 2 visits that afternoon to men in Cooperville whose names she didn't share with Gideon and Eliza, and she came back from the second one looking satisfied in the particular way of a person who has set something in motion that cannot now be stopped. The countermove came that evening. Gideon and Eliza were at the Dunmore Hotel. Irony not lost on either of them, given that it was where Margaret Carveth had been staying, when a man arrived with a message from Aldous Crane. Not Fetters this time, not an armed rider, but a formally dressed young man who handed over a sealed envelope and stood waiting for a response with the carefully neutral expression of someone who understood he was carrying something volatile. The letter inside was short. Crane's handwriting was large and confident, the handwriting of a man who had written letters his whole life expecting them to be taken seriously. Mr. Hale, the documents you are currently in possession of are the subject of active legal proceedings in this county. Removing or transmitting them without authorization constitutes interference in a pending legal matter. I strongly advise you to consult with an attorney before taking any action that could expose you to significant personal liability. I remain available to discuss a resolution that would be beneficial to all parties. A. Crane. Gideon read it and handed it to Eliza. She read it and set it on the table. He doesn't have a pending legal matter. He's inventing one. He's buying time. Gideon folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket next to his father's. 2 letters now, carried against his chest. One explaining everything that had gone wrong, one trying to stop everything from being made right. He doesn't know yet how much we have or who we've talked to. He's trying to find out if this can still be contained. Can it? No. He said it without satisfaction, just as a fact he'd arrived at and was now reporting. Clara's message is already on its way to Albuquerque, even if Crane came to this room right now and took the documents. The telegram has described their contents in enough detail that the territorial office has cause to investigate. The only thing taking the documents would accomplish is criminal evidence suppression, which is a different kind of problem for him. He told the messenger to inform Mr. Crane that he'd received the letter and had no further comment, and the young man left looking relieved to have completed his errand without incident. The territorial investigators arrived in Cooperville 6 days later, 2 of them with credentials from the Land Commission and a letter of authorization from the territorial governor's office that named the specific allegations they were there to examine. Clara had done her work well. They came in on the Friday stage, unannounced, and went directly to Clara's dry goods store because she'd told them to, and they spent 4 hours with the documents before emerging with faces that Gideon could not read and requesting a meeting with him and Eliza the following morning. That night, for the first time since this had started, Gideon slept for 7 straight hours. The meeting the following morning was in the back room of Clara's store, around a table barely large enough for 5 people. The senior investigator was a man named Caswell, thin, methodical, with the careful diction of someone who'd been trained to say exactly what he meant and nothing more. His associate, a younger woman named Bright, who said almost nothing and wrote almost everything, sat beside him with a ledger of her own that she filled steadily throughout the conversation. The documents are authentic, Caswell said. We've had time to conduct preliminary verification. The handwriting on the correspondence matches samples we were able to obtain from county records. The land office stamps on the transfer documents are consistent with the period, and the officer named, Virgil Moss, was indeed employed in that capacity during the relevant years. He set his hands flat on the table. What you've brought us is substantial, Mr. Hale. I want to be clear about that, but I also want to be clear that what comes next is a legal process with its own timeline and requirements. I'm not in a position to make promises about outcomes. I'm not asking for promises, Gideon said. I'm asking for the process to happen. It will happen. Crane will fight it. Yes, he will. He has resources and he'll use them. Caswell looked at him steadily. So does the Territorial Land Commission. And we have something Crane doesn't have, which is documentation he wrote himself, in his own hand, naming his own actions. He paused. Men who are confident they'll never be held to account sometimes keep very thorough records. Eliza, who had been sitting quietly through most of this, said, My family's property, the Rowan homestead north of the county line. It's in the ledger. Caswell looked at his notes. I saw that. He was quiet for a moment. I can't promise restitution, but I can tell you that the transfer is listed without a legal transfer date, which suggests the documentation was either lost or never properly completed, which gives us a different kind of avenue than the outright fraudulent transfers. He glanced at his associate, who nodded without looking up. It's worth pursuing. Eliza nodded once. She looked at the table for a moment, then looked up, and her expression had the particular quality of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, beginning, cautiously, to release. Harlan Prentice surrendered his law license before the official proceeding reached him. He came to Clara's store on a Thursday morning, looking considerably diminished from the last time Gideon had seen him, 2 years ago, at a county meeting, prosperous and untouchable. He was carrying a leather folder that he set on Clara's counter and said, without preamble, I'd like to speak to the investigators. They're in Albuquerque, Clara said. When will they be back? When they have what they need. She looked at him. Is there something you'd like to contribute to what they have? Prentice looked at the leather folder. He was 60 years old, and he looked older than that this morning, the kind of overnight aging that happened to men when they understood that the structure they'd been standing on was no longer there. I kept my own records, he said, separate from what Crane knew about. I kept them because... He stopped. I kept them. That's all. He pushed the folder across the counter. I'd like that considered. Gideon was in the store when this happened. He stood near the back wall and watched Prentice walk out, and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Prentice had made his accounting, belatedly and self-interestedly, but he'd made it, and what he'd carried in that folder turned out to be detailed enough that Caswell, when he returned from Albuquerque with 2 additional investigators, spent 3 days going through it. Crane was a different matter. Crane did not surrender anything. He hired lawyers from Denver who arrived in Cooperville on a Wednesday and took up residence at the Dunmore Hotel and filed 3 separate motions within the first week. One challenging the authenticity of the documents, one challenging the jurisdiction of the Territorial Commission, one alleging that Clement Hale had been a co-conspirator whose testimony by letter was inadmissible. He fought with the resources of a man who had spent 40 years accumulating them precisely against the day when he might need to. He lost the jurisdiction motion first. Then the authenticity challenge, when the Commission's document examiner submitted a 17-page report. The co-conspirator argument fell apart against the substance of Clement's letter and the corroborating evidence in Prentice's own records, which showed Clement had been attempting to document the fraud rather than perpetuate it. The formal finding came on a Tuesday, 7 weeks after Gideon and Eliza had ridden into Cooperville with a satchel and a dead man's letter. Gideon was at the ranch when Remy brought the telegram from town. He read it standing in the yard in the afternoon light. The finding confirmed fraudulent transfer of 14 properties, directed return of title where living heirs could be identified and wished to claim, named Aldous Crane, the estate of Virgil Moss, and Harlan Prentice as parties to the fraud, referred the criminal matter to the territorial court. He stood in the yard for a while after reading it. The horses were moving in the pasture. The late-season grass was going yellow at the edges. It was a quiet afternoon on a working ranch, ordinary in every visible way. He thought about his father riding out on a fall morning with papers in a bag, and a plan that had come apart almost immediately, and then slowly, across 11 years, had come back together in a form Clement hadn't planned and hadn't lived to see. He thought about 14 families and 14 mornings when someone had found out their ground was not what they'd believed it to be. He thought about Eliza Rowan at his kitchen table, the first night, with road dust on her coat and a satchel that was heavier than it looked. He folded the telegram and put it in his shirt pocket and went inside to write a letter. It took him 4 drafts to say what he wanted to say, which was not complicated but was difficult in the particular way that true things were sometimes difficult to say without getting in their own way. The final version was 2 paragraphs. He sealed it and addressed it to Eliza, who had gone back to Fort Callum 3 weeks earlier to settle her affairs there, and he gave it to Remy to take to the post office with the quiet instruction to make sure it actually got there. Remy looked at the address on the envelope and looked at Gideon's face and didn't say a single word, which was one of the many reasons Gideon had kept him around for 14 years. The letter reached Fort Callum on a Friday. Eliza knew it was from Gideon before she opened it because his handwriting on the envelope had the same slight formal lean she recognized from his father's letter. Something inherited, apparently, along with the ranch and the stubbornness and the tendency to say difficult things in the fewest possible words. She was sitting at the small table in the room she rented from a woman named Haskins, who asked no questions and charged fair, and she held the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The letter said, "The commission ruled in our favor, 14 properties. Prentice has cooperated with investigators and Crane's legal efforts have failed at every step so far. The criminal referral is with the territorial court. I expect it will take time, but I expect it will conclude correctly. I also want to say something that I wrote 3 times in different ways before arriving at this version, which is still not entirely right, but is as close as I can get. You came to my ranch carrying something that cost you considerable effort and no small amount of risk, on behalf of a promise made to a man who had done something for your family when he didn't have to. I've been thinking about what kind of person does that, and I've concluded that it's the kind of person I haven't encountered very often. I would like for you to come back, not to repay a debt. There isn't one. Or if there is, I'm not keeping accounts. I mean something different than that. I think you know what I mean. If you don't, or if the answer is no, I'll understand that too. Gideon Hale." She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window at the Fort Callum street, which was an unremarkable street in an unremarkable town, and she thought about what she had in this place and what she had to go back to. What she had in Fort Callum was a room, a small amount of money, and the grave of her father in the town cemetery, which she visited on Sundays. What she had to go back to was a question she'd been avoiding, in the way that people avoided questions when the answer frightened them, not because it was bad, but because it was larger than they'd been allowing themselves to want. She wrote back the same evening. Her letter was shorter than his, which felt right. She arrived at the Hale Ranch on a Wednesday 3 weeks later, on the afternoon stage from Cooperville. She hadn't sent word of the exact day, partly because she wasn't certain until she was on the stage, and partly because she didn't want a reception, didn't want the pressure of someone waiting at the gate with something prepared. She wanted to arrive the way she'd arrived the first time, on her own terms, carrying her own bag. Gideon was in the north pasture when Remy came to find him. Remy said only, "Woman at the house," carrying a satchel. And then he went back to what he'd been doing, which was the correct response. Gideon came down from the pasture without rushing, because rushing would have been a performance, and he was done performing things he didn't feel. He found Eliza on the porch, sitting on the top step with her satchel beside her, and her face turned up toward the late afternoon light, and she heard him coming and looked over, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You came," he said. "I said I would in my letter." "I know, I wasn't certain you meant it." She looked at him with the direct, unsentimental gaze he'd come to think of as specifically hers. The look of someone who said what they meant because they'd decided long ago that saying anything else was a waste of the limited time available. "I meant it." He sat down on the step beside her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be making a point of the distance. They sat like that for a while, looking out at the yard, the barn, the pasture, the ridge beyond going amber in the late light. "The Rowan land," he said. "Caswell told me the transfer voiding is moving through. It'll probably be finalized before winter." She was quiet for a moment. "I know. He wrote to me as well." She looked at her hands. "I don't know what I'll do with it, honestly. My father's been gone 2 years. I've been in Fort Callum for most of that time trying to figure out the next thing." She paused. "The land is real to me in a way I can't entirely explain. Even though I haven't stood on it in 15 years, it's the ground my father broke. The first thing he built. It matters that it comes back, even if I don't know yet what coming back means for me. You don't have to know yet, Gideon said. She looked at him. Is that from experience? Considerable experience. He looked at the ridge. I ran this ranch for 16 years, not knowing what I was building toward. I thought I was just keeping it going, maintaining what my father left. He stopped. Turns out, I was waiting for the ground to be real, for the thing I was standing on to be what I thought it was. And now? Now I know what it is, all of it. The good parts and the parts that cost something to look it straight. He paused. It's still mine. That didn't change, but it means something different than it did. The criminal proceedings against Aldous Crane began that fall and extended into the following year the way territorial court proceedings did when the defendant had money and lawyers and the patience of a man who believed delay was its own kind of winning. Crane was 60 years old, and he played the long game with the practiced ease of someone who'd been playing it his whole life. But the documents held. That was the thing about evidence that had been sealed in oilskin in a rock canyon for 11 years. It didn't waver under cross-examination, didn't revise its account, didn't become uncertain when the lawyers asked it the same question 6 different ways. The ledger said what it said. The letters said what they said. Crane's own handwriting said what it said, in ink, across 30 years of careful criminal enterprise, that he documented himself because he'd never genuinely believed he would be made to answer for any of it. Gideon testified in October. He rode to Cooperville on a Tuesday morning and sat in a chair in a room with high windows and answered questions for 4 hours from lawyers on both sides and the commission's own examiner, and he was precise and he was factual and he did not editorialize because the facts didn't require editorializing. They were sufficient on their own. When Crane's lawyer asked him whether his father had been a willing participant in the original fraud, Gideon said, "For a brief period, yes. And then he spent 11 years trying to undo it, and died in the effort. That's in the record." The lawyer moved on. Eliza testified the following day. Gideon wasn't in the room for it. Witnesses were kept separate, but Clara Aldred was, and she told him afterward that Eliza had been the clearest witness she'd seen in 30 years of watching territorial proceedings. She said what she knew and nothing more, and she didn't apologize for the gaps, Clara said. Half the witnesses I've seen over the years try to fill in what they don't know to make themselves sound more certain. She didn't do that. No, Gideon said. She doesn't do that. Clara looked at him with the sharp, measuring look she used on everyone. She's staying at the ranch? For now. She's deciding about the Rowan land, and after that, that's her decision to make. He held Clara's gaze. I've made my preferences known. What she does with them is up to her. Clara seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her counter and didn't say anything further about it, which was about as much approval as Clara Aldred expressed about anything. Crane was convicted in February on 7 counts of fraudulent land transfer and 2 counts of document falsification. His lawyers filed appeals that would take years to resolve, and he was a wealthy man who would not spend those years in discomfort. That was the way of it, and Gideon had known from the start that the outcome would be imperfect. Justice in imperfect systems produced imperfect results, and the choice wasn't between imperfect and perfect, but between imperfect and nothing at all. He'd made his peace with that arithmetic before they'd ever ridden into the canyon. What mattered more, in the immediate and practical sense, was the Land Commission's decisions on the 14 properties. Some of the families had moved on too thoroughly to claim. The Kessler widow had remarried, her children were grown elsewhere, and the land itself had been absorbed into Crane's operation to the point where its boundaries were disputed. Those cases were complex and slow, and some of them would never fully resolve. Gideon understood this without satisfaction, but without surprise. But 7 of the families, or their heirs, were located and notified, and the titles were restored. 7 pieces of ground that had been taken by paperwork were returned by paperwork, which was imperfect poetry, but was also the only kind the law knew how to write. One of those 7 was the Rowan homestead. Eliza got the formal notification on a Thursday morning in late February, sitting at Gideon's kitchen table with coffee that was still too strong because neither of them had ever adjusted it. She read the document twice, folded it carefully, and set it beside her cup. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She sat with it for a while. He let her, because some things needed sitting with, and any impulse to fill the silence would have been about his discomfort rather than her need. "I want to go see it," she said finally. "The land. I haven't been there since I was 17. "I know." "Will you come with me?" He looked at her across the table. She was asking a simple question on its surface and a more complicated one underneath it, and they both understood the difference. He'd been learning over the months she'd been at the ranch that Eliza operated this way. Layered, but not obscure. She said the simple version and waited to see if you understood the complicated version, and if you didn't, she found another way. He understood. "Yes," he said. They rode to the Rowan land on a Saturday in early March, when the weather had turned enough to make the trip comfortable without yet being genuinely warm. It was 30 miles, a long day's ride, through country that changed gradually from the grass plains around the Hale Ranch to rolling terrain cut through with dry creek beds and scattered with the cedar and pinon that marked the higher ground. Eliza was quiet for most of the ride, not uncomfortably so. She was a person who could be quiet for long periods without it meaning anything particular, which was a quality Gideon had come to value more than he could easily explain. He'd spent years in the company of people who filled silence with noise because they were afraid of what silence said, and he'd learned to find it exhausting. The Rowan homestead came into view in the mid-afternoon, a low valley with a creek running through it, the remnants of a fence line along the south boundary, and the stone foundation of the original house visible in the long grass where the structure above it had long since collapsed or been taken for other uses. Eliza stopped her horse at the valley's edge and looked down at it for a long time. He stopped beside her and waited. "He built that fence himself," she said. "My father. Every post. It took him a summer." She was looking at the remaining posts, maybe a third of the original line still standing, tilted at varying angles, weathered gray. He was not a man who was good at very many things. He was a poor farmer and a worse businessman, and he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. She paused. But he built things. He built that fence, and he built the house that's gone now, and he tried to build something for us here. That was real." "It was real," Gideon said. "Crane took it with paper, and paper gave it back." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I want to do with it. And? I don't want to farm it alone. I don't know how to farm it alone, and I don't particularly want to learn." She held his gaze steadily. "But I don't want to sell it. I don't want it to go back to being someone else's. Not yet. Not after what it cost to get it returned." "What are you thinking?" "There are families, they see, the ones whose land couldn't be returned, the cases too complicated or too long dissolved. Some of them have nowhere to go. Some of them have been working other men's land for wages that don't stretch." She paused. "This valley is good ground. The water's reliable. A family who knew what they were doing could build something here." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought, not selling it, but letting it be used. Properly. With agreements in writing this time, real ones, not Prentice's kind." Gideon looked at the valley. The creek was catching the afternoon light. The grass down there was good. He could see that, even from this distance, the color of it, the way it moved. "That's a complicated thing to manage from 30 miles away," he said. "I know. You'd need someone to help you with the legal side of it. Clara Aldred has contacts." "I've already spoken to Clara." He looked at her. "When?" "Last month. When you were in Cooperville for the hearing." She said it without apology. "I wanted to think it through before I said anything to you." "That's very like you." "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's an observation." He looked back at the valley. "The family you have in mind. Do you have someone specific?" "The Lundqvists had a son. He's 30 now, married, 2 children. He's been working hired land north of Cooperville. He came to me after the commission ruling and asked—" She stopped. "He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted to know if his family's land would come back. It won't. His parents' specific claim was too complicated, but he's a good man who knows this kind of ground." She paused. "I thought he could work the Rowan land under a fair arrangement, 5 years. with right of purchase at the end if it goes well. And the money? Modest. I don't need much. She looked at him. I have somewhere to be. The directness of it landed simply, without fanfare, the way she did most things. He'd been waiting for her to say something like it for months, and somehow it still caught him slightly sideways, which he suspected was exactly the right response to something that mattered. You have somewhere to be, he said, if the offer still stands. It stands. She nodded once, the same way she'd nodded at the end of that first night in his kitchen, the acknowledgement of a thing settled. Then she rode down into the valley, and he followed, and they walked the horses along the fence line her father had built post by post across a summer long ago, and she ran her hand along the top rail of one of the sections still standing, and didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything either, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. He burned the marriage proposals that spring, not dramatically. He didn't make an event of it. He found them in the box where he'd put them over the years, a dozen letters in various states of formality, and he put them in the fireplace on a cold March evening and watched them go. It wasn't a statement about the women who had written them. It wasn't bitterness about anything, or a rejection of anything. It was more like clearing ground, the way you burned off old growth, not because the growth had been bad, but because you needed the field to be ready for what came next. He'd turned away every one of those women for reasons he'd told himself were about timing, about the ranch, about not being ready. Some of that had been true, but the larger truth, the one he hadn't looked at directly until now, was that he'd been standing on uncertain ground, and he'd known it without knowing what the uncertainty was, and he hadn't been able to ask another person to stand on it with him. He knew what the ground was now. All of it. The solid parts and the parts that had cost something, and the parts that were still in the slow process of being resolved the way that things in territorial courts were always slowly resolved. It wasn't clean. It would never be entirely clean. His father had done harm and had tried to undo it, and had died without finishing what he'd started, and Gideon had finished it, and the finishing had been neither triumphant nor cost-free. That was the truth of it, and it was the only kind of truth available, and it was enough. Eliza came in from outside while the last of the letters was burning, and looked at the fireplace and looked at him and said, "What was that?" "Old paperwork," he said. She looked at him for a second longer than necessary, the way she did when she knew he was being technically accurate and substantially incomplete. And then she went to the kitchen to start supper without pressing the point, because she was a person who understood the difference between things that needed discussing and things that had already been decided. That was the thing about her, finally, that he couldn't have explained to anyone who asked and couldn't have predicted before she walked through his barn door on a Thursday afternoon with road dust on her coat and borrowed boots on her feet. It wasn't her courage, though she had that. It wasn't her competence, though she had that too. It was the fact that she was real, entirely, uncomplicatedly real, the same person in every room, the same measure of herself, whether she was sitting across from territorial investigators or walking a dead man's fence line or drinking too strong coffee at his kitchen table at midnight. He'd been surrounded his whole life by people performing some version of themselves. He hadn't known how much that cost him until it stopped. The Lundqvist boy, a man really, whose name was Eric and who arrived in the valley in April with his wife and two small children and a wagon loaded with everything they owned, asked Gideon once toward the end of his first week on the Rowan land what had made him willing to take on a situation this complicated. Gideon thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. They were standing at the edge of the south field in the late afternoon, looking at ground that Eric had already started turning for spring planting, the dark soil coming up in clean rows. "My father made a mistake early in his life," Gideon said. "It cost him everything, and it cost people around him things they didn't get back. He spent 11 years trying to fix it and didn't live to see it fixed." He paused. "I finished it for him. But that's not why I did it." "Why did you do it?" "Because 14 families lost their ground to a lie, and the truth was sitting in a canyon waiting for someone to go get it." He looked at the field. "That's not complicated. It just wasn't easy." Eric was quiet for a moment. He was a large man, quiet in the way of people who had grown up working hard and hadn't developed much use for words that didn't carry weight. "My father never got over losing this land," he said. "He talked about it his whole life, not with anger. He got past the anger, but like something in him was always oriented toward this valley, like a compass that wouldn't stop pointing. He looked at the field. I want to build something here that would make sense to him, something solid. That's the right thing to want, Gideon said. He rode back to the Hale Ranch in the late afternoon, with the kind of tiredness that came from work that had been worth doing, different from the exhaustion of years spent maintaining something whose foundation you weren't sure of. The ranch came into view as the light went low and gold, same as it always did, same as it had for as long as he could remember. The barn and the house and the outbuildings arranged across the land in the particular way that places acquired over decades of being lived in. Eliza was on the porch when he rode in, the way she sometimes was in the evenings when the weather was good, sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee, watching the light change on the ridge. She looked over when he came through the gate, and he raised a hand and she raised her cup in return, and he put his horse up and walked to the porch and sat beside her on the step. They sat there as the light went down, the ridge going from gold to amber to the flat gray of early dark. The horses were quiet in the pasture. The ranch settled around them the way places did at the end of working days. Not silent, but stilled, the particular piece of things that have been used for their purpose. "How's the field?" she asked. "Coming along." He looked at the ridge. "Eric Lundqvist is going to make something good down there." "I think so too." A pause. The first stars were coming out above the ridge, faint and then less faint. "Remy told me today he's thinking about retiring," Gideon said. "Is he?" "He's been saying it for 3 years. This is the first time I believed him." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you worried about finding someone?" "Not particularly." He looked at her. "I've gotten better at accepting help." She made a small sound that was the closest she generally got to a laugh. Not dismissive, just acknowledging something she found accurate and slightly absurd. "You're still the most self-sufficient person I've met. I'm working on it." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." The stars came out properly now, the sky over the ridge going fully dark and filling in. He thought about his father's letter, still in his breast pocket. He'd carried it there since the night Eliza first arrived, a habit he'd developed without deciding to. He'd have to find it a proper place eventually. Not hidden, not put away somewhere to be forgotten. Somewhere that acknowledged what it was. A hard accounting written by a man trying to do right by what he'd done wrong. Delivered by a woman who'd made a promise and kept it across 17 miles of road. That was what had started all of this. A promise kept. A piece of paper that told the truth. A woman who showed up at a barn door carrying something heavier than it looked and set it down on a stranger's kitchen table and waited. He'd spent his whole life being told that the frontier rewarded the hard and the self-made, the men who asked nothing from anyone and built from their own 2 hands and their own force of will. And there was truth in that. He'd built something real here, and it had cost him real effort. But the part that no one told you, the part he'd learned the hard way across a long adulthood, was that what you built alone was only ever as solid as the ground under it. And if you never let anyone help you check the ground, you might spend years on something that was already shifting. His father had known that. He'd known it too late and paid too much for the knowing, but he'd known it. And he'd sent a letter from a dying man's room in Fort Callum, and the letter had found its way. Some things made it. Not all things, not even most things, but some. And the ones that made it through the canyon and the crooked courts and the long years of imperfect process, those meant something specific and hard-won and real in a way that nothing easy could mean. Eliza finished her coffee and set the cup on the step beside her and leaned back on her palms and looked at the sky. She didn't say anything more. Neither did he. The stars were out fully now over the ridge, the same ridge they'd be there tomorrow and the day after, over the same ground that had been here before either of them and would be here long after. The difference was that now he knew what it was, and she was sitting on the steps beside him, and the accounts had been settled as well as accounts like that ever got settled. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, he had come to understand, what most people spent their whole lives trying to get to, and many never did. He reached over and picked up her empty cup and held it along with his own, and neither of them moved to go inside yet, and the evening settled around the Hale Ranch the way evenings did, slowly, without ceremony, the way real things always arrived.